Hello everyone. You probably noticed that I made a video a few weeks ago called Is Horror Leftist? It has now reached over 40,000 views and has given my channel a significant boost. So briefly, thank you. Thank you to everyone who took the time to click on it, watch it in its entirety, leave a comment, or share it around. One of the more enjoyable parts of the publishing process is seeing how people respond to my ideas, whether what I've put down actually connects with people, whether people understand and vibe with my thinking. I always try to have verbal conversations with friends about my pieces before I publish, but often the entire writing process is intimately private, contained almost entirely in my own head, and so I can feel self-conscious by the time I hit record. I'm glad to see then how the video has resonated. My videos typically hit 1,000 views on a good run, so when this video hit 20,000 within 2 days, I was startled, but pleased, of course. With its greater reach, that meant I got a lot more feedback than usual, and I've read every single comment that's been posted. 99.99% of the comments have been gushingly positive, which is very flattering. Many comments expressed gratitude that I tackled an angle to the In Praise of Shadows video that many other reactions hadn't, which was definitely an intention of mine. But what I'm always looking for are those precious nuggets of criticism, pushback, or alternate angles that bear comment. Let's dig into some of the ideas that you, the commenters, have brought to light. This comment asks what research I'm referencing, and also asks whether the research has failed to replicate. I probably should be more anal about times I refer to research or make academic claims, but to summarize, here are some of the studies about political differences in values, including disgust. Jonathan Haidt's work in moral foundations theory is everywhere. He has a whole research think tank at this point. That's where charts like these came from. As to the claim about right-wing people valuing the intimate circle and the left-wing valuing the outsider, you can find studies like these that demonstrate how the two ends are mirrors of each other. The left valuing humanity over nation, the community over family, and the right being the other way around. You can see in this image how the conservatives' empathy is focused on close circles like family and friends, while the leftist empathy is focused on outside rings, including animals, fish, and space rocks. Basically, the more remote the group is from the individual, the more empathy the leftist has for it, and vice versa. Here's an example of a study I mentioned, that right-wing people are more disgusted by body odor and bad smells. Similar studies have found the same disgust difference when presenting sexual or violent pictures to subjects. One point of clarity, though, which is evident in a follow-up study, is that conservatives aren't the only ones who experience disgust. The context in which they experience great disgust is the significant variable. Those on the right wing are more disgusted by morbid smells and images, while the left is disgusted by things like xenophobia and capitalism. An interesting element out of this study is the psychological processing done when individuals encounter disgusting images. Those on the left experience initial disgust responses, but reappraise their emotions, leading to less disgust. The more a person reappraises, the more tolerant they are of disgusting things. This all tracks with how I portray the leftists' response to horror. Naturally lower disgust sensitivity for morbid spectacle, and when they do experience disgust, they check themselves in order to dismiss or neutralize it. Now onto the secondary part of the question, hasn't this research failed to replicate? The answer is, for all of these, probably. Social sciences is full of replication issues. I'm not an expert in the field, so I can't comfortably lay out all the necessary critiques of moral foundations theory, so I guess all I can really do is say some of this just seems reliably and intuitively true through adjacent studies about politics and psychology, and through the writings of political pundits. Vibe check seems legit. I got several comments asking, if the left is so predisposed to the acceptance of differences, how is it that they become so blindly hateful of their political opponents? Several people commented either in a querying or a critical way on this very question because it seems like an obvious contradiction. I would posit, though, it's more of a paradox than a contradiction. To put simply, in order to uphold the values of tolerance, one must refuse to tolerate intolerance. The broad umbrella of acceptable values cannot contain the antithesis or self-defeating value. Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance sums up the left's understanding of this issue and highlights that while it may seem philosophically contradictory, in the practice of politics, it is the only reasonable way to uphold progress. That, I think, is a sufficient explanation on the political side of things. Psychologically, though, from the framework I set up, there are some further possible reasons that the left can be both so open and hostile at the same time. One possibility is that outside threat perception is contextual. Everyone has an us versus them mentality. Everyone hates the outsider and prefers the insider. In that case, the left could be simply redirecting this powerful emotion away from the identity dimension, so they're open to differences in race, class, gender, and so on, and into the political dimension, so they're hostile to political outsiders and certain economic groups. They see the poor, people of color, disabled, gay, or immigrant as their insider, and the wealthy white Republicans as outsiders. This can be confusing, especially when you consider how many vocal leftists are wealthy white people, but political alignment is the defining factor here. Hence the "you ain't black" comment, and other ways the left otherizes political outsiders who would otherwise be included in their broad sense of us. On the other hand, it could be that leftists have some kind of affinity inversion. Maybe they know that different people are outsiders, but somehow the natural tendency to prefer insiders has been flipped. The more outsider a person is, the more affinity the leftist feels for them. The closer the person is to the leftist, whether by nationality, race, or gender, the more suspicious, hostile, and threatened the leftist becomes. Politics in this model is almost unimportant. Which of these models is correct? The political outsider theory or the affinity inversion theory? I think there's research that lends credence to the latter, but it's also possible that different leftists experience and rationalize this paradox in different ways. This person left a comment and asked if conservatives aren't also scolds within the horror community. I think this is a valid criticism, so let's explore it a bit. It would be correct to say not all conservatives in horror communities would escape a descriptor of scold. Hopefully it's clear in the context of my video that I was, in that moment, painting a very broad stroke in explaining why Zane might feel centrists side with conservatives in the community, a statement which in itself is a broad generalization. I'm sure, too, there are leftists in the horror community who happily indulge in their left-wing beliefs without causing any particular grief. Maybe someone with more experience in these social settings can add to my understanding. But from me, an outsider, I've seen the dynamic play out thusly. An old niche, nerdy hobby subculture arises, in which the old guard is mostly white, apolitical males who like violence and buxom ladies. Think video games, Dungeons and Dragons, Star Wars, Warhammer, comic books, Magic the Gathering. What seems to have happened in these circles is, upon that subculture being discovered by a wider audience, actively political leftists have entered those spaces and caused some disruption by challenging elements that they consider toxic, uninclusive, bigoted, misogynist, or problematic. Maybe the leftists have a point, maybe they don't, but it becomes a real cultural conflict between the new and the old agents. I imagine the conservative or centrist response to this is a form of gatekeeping, but it is a bit different from what Zane and his ilk have in mind. As for leftists entering established fandoms, they often seem to plant their flag and say things like, "This media is leftist in nature, and it has always been leftist," and then use this reasoning to justify pushing out conservative people and ideas. When in early iterations of the fandom, political discourse was not a major element of the community. This is what Zane states plainly in his video. He doesn't want to allow that ideology to exist, either in horror as media or in the discourse spaces. He wants certain beliefs barred at the gate. Anti-woke media types have expressed gatekeeping principles themselves, to be sure. But I think it's worth noting that this gatekeeping has been a reaction to the perceived invasion of apolitical spaces. I don't think the centrists and conservatives have ever tried to gatekeep leftists from the horror fandom. After all, Zane's right. His earlier videos have been consistently popular and well received, despite their obvious leftist bent. And no one had called for shunning him from the community because of his Marxist analysis. The strongest calls to banish Zane from the community happened after he declared that people with conservative views should not be allowed. Anti-woke rhetoric can be tired, overwrought, asinine, but I don't think its purpose is to push out leftists. It is a reaction to a particular attitude some leftists bring to old fandoms. It is a pushback against persons who are trying to colonize and transform a space. Now, are there people who lash out at any leftist ideology that appears in the fandom, no matter how innocuous or unintrusive it is? Of course. But again, broad strokes. I received this comment from Making Media Matter. When I saw this commenter's name and the nature of their comment, I knew they had to be a content creator, and okay. The major claim here is that my argument is missing historical context. Horror is left-wing because the creators of horror have used the genre to push boundaries and explore deviant or socially unacceptable sexual identities, even allowing for actors who are social outcasts to flourish. I'm not sure what to make of this criticism, except to say that I did talk about that explicitly several times. I don't know how much more clearly I could state that I accept the basic premise of the historicist frame. Horror directors are largely leftist, and the horror genre has been home to progressive spectacle and boundary breaking. But this criticism completely misses the latter half of my argument, in which I reject the historicist frame as essentially an authorial intent argument, which is not an invalid perspective, but one that ignores how meaning can come from more than one place. By simply saying it's leftist because leftists made it, ignores the sociological purpose of horror, the psychological dimension of fear, and yes, an even broader historicist view back into the distant past. It's also, and a few commenters noted this, an incredibly limited Western modern frame that doesn't account for how horror might function in non-Western and non-affluent parts of the world. Finally, I have to say I'm skeptical when it comes to leftists' insistence that they can interpret intent from historical figures. Did the classic horror directors recruit queer people for their movies out of a leftist agenda to push these identities as normal? Or were they, like everyone else in the business, simply making use of a pool of actors who couldn't get work elsewhere? Was this predatory? Beneficial? How many of these actors came out of horror cinema unscathed by abuse or financial exploitation? Is Sleepaway Camp really a tale about queer identity? Or did the director use the freak show aesthetic for cheap terror, ultimately undermining any progressive reading? Again, this is not a matter of those readings being entirely invalid. I'm sure there are legitimate readings of these texts from a leftist perspective, but where they tend to fall apart is both in the overconfidence in one's claims and an inability or unwillingness to explore alternate interpretations of the same information. Rather than a stance of, here's one way to look at it, too often video essays boast that they contain the true meaning of a work. If you really are progressive, you need to untangle yourself from this habit as soon as possible. It comes off as arrogant and can often lead you to absurdities that you've blinded yourself from recognizing. Now, to close out this video, I'm going to highlight a few interesting and insightful comments that were under the video. Obviously, there were over 1,100 comments on this, so if yours didn't get highlighted, please don't feel bad. This is just a very small selection. So this comment from Nadaru1486, quite a long comment, so just this section here. Zane, for all intents and purposes, is a kind of conservative. He wants the genre of film and the artistic process as a whole to be stagnant and comfortable for him. Everything has to be political, and everything should be advocating for his political position. Here we have a comment from Chris Ossus. The depressing thing is that there was an actual left-wing perspective on The Hills Have Eyes that In Praise of Shadows completely missed. The family of cannibals could be interpreted as a grotesque mirror of Big Bob Carter's vision of the perfect conservative family, a xenophobic and isolated clan that is led with a tyrannical fist by a patriarch who promotes only a hatred of outsiders. and a view of women as nothing more than glorified sex objects and breeding slaves. To say nothing of the fact that they're only cannibals in the first place because Papa Jupiter refuses to just leave a region that has long since gone barren, on the shallow principle of the land being theirs. The remake added a wrinkle of them being victims of nuclear testing makes them a literal manifestation of the cost of the American government's fixation on warfare. Drawing Dragon leaves another long comment, but just to highlight here. It's such a breath of fresh air to hear someone finally expressing that we are all drawn to these things like horror because we are all human, and explaining that yes, we see the world wildly differently, but that doesn't make us incompatible in an apolitical space. The difference between fear and spectacle, and the proclivities between the two extremes towards one or the other, was really interesting. I'd heard about the disgust-response differences between left-leaning and right-leaning people, but I'd never applied it to the horror genre. But it makes perfect sense. I would be considered very conservative in my political beliefs. And I have no stomach whatsoever for gore or crassness for its own sake. I can only handle it if it's there to serve a narrative purpose. That would also explain why I've never been into horror films, but I'm obsessed with horror games. Films seem much more reliant on spectacle, while games seem to be more focused on building tension. Obviously, these are just generalizations. Both forms of media have both forms of horror present. But I also don't begrudge anyone who finds catharsis in the spectacle, or think of anyone less if they're not able to handle terror while being able to handle disgust. We all share human experience, but we're all individuals with different fears and different interests. Hearing In Praise of Shadows just basically insist people who don't think like him should be ostracized and shamed from an apolitical entertainment media because they don't vote the way he does is really disheartening. Aaron VT points out that the Distributist did a good video on this. Horror is reactionary by nature, therefore conservative more often than not. I'll link the Distributist video in the description. Ms. Mimi says, I've noticed an obsession with authorial intent and tendency to uplift it as the ultimate factor that determines a piece of fiction's meaning, and to complain about the virality of incorrect interpretations that stray from what the author wanted emerge within the online left over the past 5 years or so. Which is bizarre to me, because that in itself is fundamentally conservative way to analyze writing, and has been since at least the mid-20th century, even before the phrase death of the author entered popular usage. Most leftist meme about right-wingers having no media literacy are primarily based around mocking them for not absorbing the correct, authorially intended message from whatever pop culture they consumed and enjoyed growing up. The Tarman says, I admin a Facebook horror group with 20,000 members. That isn't a flex, as it's mostly stupid shitposts and mind-numbing discussions about the same tired topics. It's just a means to preface that I've directly encountered a lot fellow horror fans one-on-one and collectively, and I must say, Zane here is emblematic of a surprisingly large amount of self-identified genre fans. He hates gatekeeping, yet gatekeeps 24/7. He thinks the most superficial thematic observations are deep. He'll flat out invent narratives about things that are provably untrue just to prove a personal agenda. He believes in deferring to the culture of horror, which conveniently excludes all opposing viewpoints from people who are, by the same standards as him, people like him, part of the horror community. It's kind of depressing, really, because he's so politically brain-rotted that he has to invent a false reality, in which his ideological counterparts have no historical precedent to feel welcome in a space where no one truly has any ground to stand in terms of claiming it as theirs. With that said, the oldest myths and folklore that turned into popular horror stories / monsters had their origins as cautionary tales, to paint societal rule breakers as literal, not figurative, monsters, which I'd say is pretty conservative. With that, I'm going to close out. Again, thank you for everyone who commented and shared and enjoyed my video. I'm looking forward to sharing future projects.